Welcome to Talk to Internal Audit, our dedicated Facebook Live series. Today's session is about skepticism, what it is and why it's important for internal auditors. Our guest, and I'm delighted to welcome him, our guest is Richard Chambers, former CEO and President of IIA Global, and as I'm sure you will all have seen, an influencer for the profession. He shares his thoughts through blogs and is very much someone that we need to listen to when we think about the internal audit profession. So grab a drink and join me as we delve into gaining a better understanding as to what skepticism is and how it can help us as internal auditors. So let me introduce myself. I'm Liz Sandwith, and I'm the Chief Professional Practices Advisor for the Chartered IIA UK and Ireland. Before we get into the stream, a couple of facts about the Institute for you to keep in mind, and these will appear shortly on your screen. As you may be aware, you can acquire CPE points from these Talk to Internal Audit sessions by logging them using our CPE template, and details of how to claim your CPE point from this live stream can be found in the comments section. So, what are we going to think about today? What is skepticism and why is it important to internal auditors? So before we go to Richard, let me begin to paint a picture for you. So applying an appropriate level of skepticism enhances the likelihood the internal auditor will understand the business in which they work, the lines of business in the sector, and their business processes, and any nuances that make their company different from others, as it naturally causes the auditor to ask questions that may otherwise go unasked. Skepticism is what enables internal auditors to form objective, independent opinions. It's the difference between repeating information and establishing facts. So today we're going to explore this further with our guest Richard Chambers, former CEO and President of IIA Global. Remember, if you like Facebook streams and want to spread the word, and I'm sure you do, be sure to share today's live stream. And you can do that by clicking the share button in the corner of your screen. After all, the more the merrier. So let's get back to some basics and start with the IIA standards. Standard 1120, individual objectivity, notes the importance of training that reinforces the nature of professional skepticism and the criticality of avoiding bias and maintaining an open and curious mindset. And then we can move on and think about the new IIA 2020 Internal Audit Competency Framework that provides detailed insight into the professional attributes expected of internal auditors. Although skepticism is not explicitly mentioned, it is a key element within the foundations for many of the attributes detailed, including objectivity and engagement fieldwork. So let's think for a moment about 5 reasons why professional skepticism is important. It's essential in the assessment and validation of evidence. It's about questioning inconsistent evidence and the reliability of data and the interview processes and the interview responses, of course. It also enables an internal auditor to consider the sufficiency and appropriateness of evidence obtained in the light of the circumstances of the engagement. For instance, what is required in a crisis situation may be different to that of a thematic review. It links closely to 3 of the 4 elements of the IPPF Code of Ethics: independence, objectivity, and competence. An internal auditor's opinion may be compromised if sufficient professional skepticism is not applied. Information cannot be received at face value. It should always be validated. Internal auditors' stakeholders, particularly the audit committee, your board, your senior management, expect internal auditors to be skeptical and ask the difficult questions that perhaps others might avoid. Professional skepticism surfaces hidden agendas, inequality, and other negatives to a healthy culture and corporate success. Skepticism requires curiosity, imagination, and critical thinking, asking what if, or so what, to help build the mental muscles associated with skepticism. It can be useful to think about something from different perspectives. It might be an insight during an interview, or body language when asked a question. And we need to also think that certainly reading body language can be much more challenging in this hybrid or remote virtual world. So we need to bear that in mind as well. The skeptical auditor trusts only in facts and data, verifies everything, and pushes past convenient interpretations of the business to find underlying issues. Sounds sensible when you have concerns about the veracity of situations. For example, where a client's turnover has shot up unexpectedly. However, when used in the wrong situation, the skeptical auditor can come across as closed, doubting, disconnected. They can be perceived as not being on the same team as the client because they approach them as they are most likely lying. At its extreme, that can lead to people hiding information, a confrontational audit tone, and less insightful findings because of the lack of trust between an auditor and the client or the organization. So there are some negatives here, and we need to understand how we better manage those negatives. So if you're just joining us, welcome to our live stream, Talk to Internal Audit. Our guest speaker today is Richard Chambers, former CEO and president of IIA Global. Today's session is about understanding why skepticism is a fundamental skill for internal audit, and hearing from Richard Chambers about why it's important to draw a line between skepticism and suspicion. So, may I introduce my guest for today, Richard Chambers. So, Richard.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Liz. It's great to be with you.
Thank you and welcome. Delighted to have you with us. So I have a series of questions for you, as you might expect. Why do you think skepticism is important to internal auditors?
Well, Liz, I think skepticism is incredibly important because first and foremost, our results, the information that we provide, the assurance or the advice that we provide has to be accurate in order to be credible. And the only way we can really ensure that accuracy is to fully evaluate the evidence that we have, and we have to do that with an open mind. Too often, I think we find that it's easy for us to conclude ahead of time that something is broken or that it isn't broken. But ultimately, we have to be willing to evaluate it on the basis of what the facts are, not what we think.
So, Richard, you talked then about facts. Can those facts be conversations we've had with people, or do they have to be data?
Well, I think they can be both and probably need to be both. And it really depends on the circumstances of the audit. The evidence The rules of evidence for audit are not that different from rules of evidence in virtually any profession. We need to, when we think about the types of evidence, we have physical evidence, testimonial evidence, documentary evidence. All of those types of evidence need to be evaluated with an objective mindset. We have to look at them, and for obviously, if it's physical evidence, it's much easier for us to draw conclusions in terms of an objective assessment. But if it's testimonial evidence, for example, an interview, then we have to probably use a much more skeptical approach to evaluating. I've had plenty of interviews that I've done in my career where I was being told something that was absolutely not true. And if I had gone in with the mindset that said, this person's going to tell me the truth and nothing but the truth, I would have missed ultimately what had transpired, and I would have drawn the wrong conclusions in my audit, and it wouldn't have been accurate.
But there is a nice balance there, isn't there, Richard, between going in and assuming that the person you are going to speak to is going to tell you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and then on the reverse, going in and assuming that they're going to lie.
Absolutely, Liz, and I can tell you that I've had audit members of my audit team, auditors who've worked for me, who fall into both of those camps. I've had the Pollyannas who assume that when they go in, everyone's going to be truthful and that it's going to be very easy to conclude what happened or what the facts are, and they'll miss things. On the other hand, I've had those who go in with absolutely no confidence and no faith in anyone, who assume that everyone has done something wrong. And you know what happens in those cases is that they are ultimately stymied because people sense that. If they sense, and that's the fine line, Liz, that I often draw between skepticism and suspicion, is that if you go in with a suspicious mindset, ultimately you're going to be stymied because people are going to sense that, or your work is going to be tainted or colored in the sense that you had drawn your conclusions ahead of time.
So Richard, you had a blog February 20th this year where you talked about internal audit drawing a line between skepticism and suspicion. We've already talked about some elements of that, but why did you think it was important enough to talk about this? And what was your advice?
Well, Liz, as I said, this is a battle that I've seen waged within internal audit departments for almost 50 years now in my career, and I think it's very important that we be skeptical. And believe me, there are people who are neither. They're neither skeptical nor suspicious. They're just sort of trotting along through the audit. I think we must be skeptical. It's so important to getting to the root cause. At the end of the day, you have to be skeptical. But then, as I pointed out in the blog, if you bring a suspicious mindset to an engagement, you're going to find yourself, number one, I don't think suspicious mindsets lend themselves well to short engagements. I have found over the course of my career that if I had a member of, or an audit team leader or the auditor who's undertaking the audit with the suspicious mindset, they want to get into every nuance, and that is ultimately not very efficient. So I just think from the standpoint of our credibility and the accuracy of our information, I think you have to bring the suspicious mindset, but be careful about being too. I mean, you have to bring the skeptical mindset, but be careful about being too suspicious.
Wise words, Richard. Thank you for that. But we've already talked about professional skepticism being a mindset, and you talked about the Pollyanna or the doubting Thomas, and that it's fundamental to internal auditors. And it needs nurturing. I said this at the beginning. We don't come into internal audit with either the skeptical skill or the fact that we should doubt everybody. So how do you think internal auditors might develop the skill of being more skeptical or skeptical?
Well, I think it comes over time with learning to learn. I think it comes over time by learning to evaluate the evidence, making sure that you have completely analyzed what's in front of you. It's part of due professional care that we must exercise as auditors. It's part of the training, as you say, the nurturing that takes place at the outset of our careers. As a senior auditor later in my career, I started out, by the way, as a young 21-year-old internal auditor almost 47 years ago. I didn't have those skills at the beginning. It was others who taught me, who coached me to evaluate evidence on the basis of objectivity. That we had an American president, many would recall, Ronald Reagan, and this was during the era of Ronald Reagan, and I think he captured it best when speaking about some geopolitical conflict or ongoing geopolitical stress. He said that we would trust but verify. And I think, to me, trust but verify is what we have to learn as auditors, whether we come into the profession as I did at a very young age, or whether we join our audit teams later on. We must recognize that the information that's presented to us, we need to come into it with the appreciation that it's well intended, that no one was out to do something wrong, but we must verify that that's true. And that's what to me, that's what the nature of skepticism really is about.
So listening to you then, Richard, I'm left wondering if skepticism is a bit like the sniff test. So sometimes when you talk to people, or you take on a new role, you sense that there is something not quite right. And I and others have called it the sniff test. Things don't smell quite right. You wouldn't necessarily know what the issue was to begin with, but as you do the audit, you gather more data, more information, and that confirms that either you were right to be doubtful, it didn't pass the sniff test, or no, it's okay, you found evidence to support that. So would we call skepticism a bit like the sniff test then?
I think it could be. I would hasten to add that a lot of times it's not that someone is necessarily trying to deceive us. It's perhaps they didn't understand themselves what had transpired or what caused a problem. I think we have to recognize that the only way we're going to get to the truth is to maintain that skepticism and to fully evaluate the evidence, maintain our professional curiosity throughout the process. I guess when I hear words like sniff test, I worry that that there's a perception that something is wrong and we need to sniff it out. But I think there may be instances where the thing that's wrong is that no one fully understood what had happened or what transpired or what caused something that we might have discovered. And so we just have to maintain our skepticism to get to the root cause.
That's a very valid challenge around the sniff test. I guess I was thinking more experienced internal auditors will pick up perhaps where the information that they are being given doesn't align, and therefore that the language, the shorthand for all of that might be, this doesn't smell quite right. I need to, as you quoted President Reagan, I need to verify, trust, but verify what I am being told. And I guess part of the challenge with skepticism is the different experiences of the internal auditor. So a more experienced internal auditor will better understand whether what they're being told makes sense, can be supported. A more junior internal auditor, I guess, would need some support.
Well, I think that's absolutely true, Liz. But I guess I would also caution that the longer an internal auditor, and this is a hazard of the trade, the longer we are in a role in a company, in an organization, the more challenging sometimes it can be to be skeptical, because we have built relationships in the company and the organization, and they could be either positive relationships or contentious ones. And so I think we have to fight the temptation, if we have a long tenure in the organization, to assume we know what people might have done, what the motives might have been, what the circumstances are going to be. And I think in some ways, a more junior or a less tenured auditor might find it easier in those cases to be skeptical, because they don't have any history. They can come in and just because they've known Mike or Jane for years, who run the contracting division, they wouldn't have come in with a perception that Mike or Jane always get it right, or there's always been a problem there. You know what I'm saying? I think that's something we also have to consider.
I think that's very true, and the Chartered IIA has some codes of practice that we reference, the financial services one, private and third sector. And in there, we talk about the role of the audit committee chair in reviewing internal audit independence and objectivity. And we have arbitrarily perhaps picked on a 7-year tenure period. So at the end of 7 years, do you still think that the head of internal audit, the CAE, is as independent and objective as they were at the beginning? And I think that it makes sense. I get that. I understand why we've said that. But equally, I am familiar with some CAEs who find their independence and objectivity compromised way sooner than 7 years, and some that have been there maybe 27 years who are still, independent and objective in what they do.
I think you absolutely assess that correctly. I think, and I never draw any judgments about longevity in a role and what that has done. In some ways, I think a seasoned, tenured chief audit executive has in many cases greater autonomy in the organization, because they've proven themselves over time. What has troubled me in a few cases is when these folks leave after maybe 15, 20 years, in some cases, as the chief audit executive, is how quickly the company scurries to find what I would consider to be someone who's much more go along to get along, that they're looking for someone who doesn't bring that level of stature and autonomy. And that's very unfortunate. And I can't tell you how many times I saw that happen, even in the last 10 years, particularly with American companies where I had a more direct relationship with some of these seasoned or tenured chief audit executives. You touched on two terms, both of which are prominent in the standards. In fact, the first two standards that the I puts forward, independence and objectivity. And I think one thing that we need to always remember, a word of caution, is they're very different terms. They're very different terms, and they're often used, unfortunately, interchangeably. And I often have to caution people that internal auditors are not independent as professionals. They're not independent. We work for a company. We're compensated by that company. It would be to a third party, we would never be perceived as independent. What we must be is objective. And to some extent, I think objectivity is perhaps underrated as far as its criticality in our standards. The internal audit function must be independent. It must be organized and placed in the organization at a level, reporting to a level that allows it to carry out its work free of interference. That's critical. But objectivity is just as critical, if not more so, because that is an individual attribute, and it's part of the mindset. And I have seen individuals who worked in internal audit departments where the department was not independent. I've seen internal auditors who were very objective, and I've seen the reverse true. I've seen independent internal audit departments or departments where there was no independence, where there were also objectivity issues. So I don't think one goes necessarily with the other. I think there would be a perception by a third party that if the internal audit function isn't independent, that the individual internal auditors can't be objective. I think that's probably going to be the case more often than not, but it isn't a guarantee.
Good point. And I think you're absolutely right, because independence is the bit that the organization brings to the internal audit function, in that it allows it to have reporting lines that enable it to do its job. But you are so right. The objectivity is what you or I bring to the internal audit team, function, activity, whatever you call it, and the work that we do that enables us to provide the assurance that our key stakeholders are looking for. And that assurance must be based on skepticism and objectivity.
Absolutely. And Liz, I think it's also important as we talk about this topic to bring in the intellectual curiosity aspect. It's one of those attributes. When we ask chief audit executives, what do you recruit for? The critical thinking and intellectual curiosity are two very, very important attributes, because I liken the curiosity aspect to a young child, a toddler, who will ask repeatedly to a parent why. If a parent is saying you can't do this, well, you can't touch the hot stove. Well, why? Well, because you're going to get your hand burnt. Well, why? This is in some ways, and in my book, Trusted Advisors, I get into this with intellectual curiosity. In some ways, it's harder to maintain, and that's the point I was making earlier. It's harder to maintain as we become more experienced and more seasoned, because there's a tendency to think we know it. That we've seen it, we know it. I don't need to ask why. And to me, that is part of skepticism, and it's part of objectivity, and it's something we must always strive to maintain as professionals.
And I think it links into the need to have these skills for every single audit. So, sometimes you will talk to colleagues and they'll say, oh, I've done that audit. I did it 3 years ago. I know what he's going to say. I can do it in 10 days. It won't take me long because I know what they're going to tell me. Therefore, and actually the bit that says therefore should ring alarm bells for the CAE, because that means they're not going to be skeptical. They're not going to be objective, potentially, because they're not going to ask the difficult questions, because they're going to assume they know the answer already.
Yeah, absolutely true. And I think one of the things that a chief audit executive must remember is to give their staff the latitude to be intellectually curious and to be skeptical. Too often as chief audit executives, we're watching the clock and we're saying, okay, this audit's got to be done. You've got to wrap it up now. I think there has to be discipline, and you have to be willing and able to watch the clock in order to audit at the speed of risk, as I often say. But at the same time, you must always make sure that if you're going to make an assertion as part of your audit work, that you have completed the appropriate audit steps, that you have assessed the evidence correctly, because one of the most significant risks we face is a challenge to our credibility. So we don't want to ever issue an audit report that isn't accurate. It's one of the cardinal sins, I think, for us as audit professionals, is to have to issue a retraction or an amendment to an audit report. So you want to make sure. It's a very delicate balancing act, maintaining the skepticism, executing or bringing the intellectual curiosity to the role, and keeping an eye on the clock to finish an audit in a timely manner. All of those things have to be balanced, and it's one of the things that makes internal audit both challenging and, to me, exciting.
I think that's really good, although I couldn't help but smile mentally when you were talking about children and the why. I'm not sure I could cope with an internal audit team of people asking, like my child did when he was small, why,
Right.
all the time. I think that would probably be quite debilitating.
No, I think it's a good analogy, but obviously our whys have to be at the appropriate level. But if we observe a condition, when we think of sort of what are the traditional elements of an audit finding, you have criteria, condition, cause, effect. That cause is the reason that you have to maintain skepticism. It's sometimes easy. Often, the cause is sitting there in plain sight. The condition is sitting there in plain sight. It's quite evident that something didn't get done correctly, or that it's broken, or that there was a crash or whatever. So you don't necessarily have to be as concerned there about the skepticism as you do when you start to get to, well, what caused it, and even what the effect was, and what could keep it from happening again. So the why has to be certainly at the appropriate professional level, but it is easy to take management's first assertion as to why something happened. If I find that they were not complying, if there was widespread non-compliance with contracting policy, for example, they may say, well, we just didn't have enough staff. We didn't get them trained properly. And as an auditor, I could say, okay, there's my cause, and I'm going to write that up. But if I keep looking, and if I keep peeling back the onion, I might ultimately find that the real reason they weren't complying had nothing to do with the number of staff or whether they were being trained. It might even be something as straightforward as they were compensated based on how many contracts they got processed per quarter. And so that's why you have to bring that skepticism, because you're often going to get explanations early in a process that may not be the right ones.
And sometimes some of those explanations are the easy ones. If I had $1 or £1 for every time somebody said, oh, we couldn't do that because we had resource impact, or staff were off sick, or carrying vacancies, I'd be a very rich lady, because
Yes.
It's often an easy one to put forward as the rationale behind it. But you are so right that sometimes when you dig a little deeper, there are other justifications why things have happened, why policies haven't been conformed with. Sometimes they even go as far as a policy decision taken by the organization that said, we are not going to do that because the impact on the organization is, significant, and they want to change the way things happen.
Right. And Liz, as you were saying that, I thought skepticism is the shovel that allows you to dig deeper.
I like that. I think that's a good term. So let's just get back a little bit to talking more about skepticism. And I was just thinking, the new world we find ourselves in, whether it's remote working, and some internal auditors will never go back to the office on anything approaching a regular basis. Others will be a hybrid, so maybe a couple of days in the office, a couple of days remote. Do you think skepticism is impacted by that world? I mentioned earlier about reading body language, sometimes to help you understand whether the information you are being given is truthful or less truthful? So how does the new working environment impact?
I've seen a couple of surveys of chief audit executives asking them, what the effects of the pandemic and working remotely have been on internal audit. And one of the concerns that chief audit executives have expressed is that working remotely makes it more challenging to ensure the quality of audits. But I think, look, I think where working remotely may be more challenging is the evaluation of physical evidence, because you don't have the opportunity to observe physically the controls that might be working. That's why I think we have to be, I hope that we never get to a point where I could sit here in my home office and be an internal auditor 5 days a week throughout the year. There has to be a blend. There has to be something approaching hybrid. I used to tell my audit teams, if you spend all day in your office here, then I'm not sure that I need you, because the reason that I need an internal auditor is someone who can go out and engage and evaluate and assess the evidence. And so I think that's something we have to bear in mind. I do think the hybrid work environment is healthy, but I also think it presents challenges, and I think we have to be careful. You're right. It is more difficult to read body language. In a one-on-one, I can read your body language somewhat, but how many times do we do interviews or have meetings with teams of folks? I wrote the most popular blog I've written in the last year was one that I wrote, the 5 things not to say at an entrance conference or an opening meeting. I think that came out in February. And one of the points that I made there is you've got to be able to read the room when you walk into that meeting. Who's sitting where? What are they? What is their demeanor? How are they? How receptive are they to the audit? If you can assess those things at the outset, it'll help you better understand the environment in which you're going to be operating. And that's hard to do on a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting, because you don't have the dynamics of the physical interaction in the room. And so I think we have to continue to leverage. I never thought I'd hear myself say we have to continue to leverage in-person work to do our jobs.
I think that's a really valid point. I was talking to a head of internal audit a couple of weeks ago, a CAE, and they were saying to me that one of their staff undertaking an audit had been caught out because they were having what they thought was a one-to-one on Teams, I think it was. But he said what they didn't know was this individual's manager was out of camera and was passing them notes in terms of the questions that they were being asked. Now, the auditor couldn't pick that up, but you would never have got that in a face-to-face, one-on-one scenario. So I think there are some potential challenges, but then equally, when you think, climate coming down the track, commuting is going to be something that people are going to be encouraging their teams to stop doing. I'm wondering how we get this balance right and how we encourage this skeptical auditor when perhaps they're only seeing part of the picture.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think what you've described there a moment ago is somewhat frightening to think about. If you were to be in an audit, be engaged in an audit where perhaps unbeknownst to you at the outset there had been a fraud committed, it might be easier to conceal that fraud if you never have a face-to-face meeting, or you're not in a situation where you're able to have that conversation. I can tell you the best over the course of my career, the best tips or the best evidence I ever got. Let me put it another way. The best answers I ever got in an audit were not in response to a question. It was someone whispering to me, you might want to look over there. And how likely are they going to be to do that in a video setting where they don't know who else might be watching? They don't know if it's being recorded. Well, they should know, but they may not. Are you going to get that kind of, whispering, hey, you may want to check out this or that? And I'm not saying that happens all the time, but it's happened a few times in my career. And those were, in some cases, explosive conversations that they were tipping me off to something that I had no idea was there. And so there we go. Do you get that in this new world? I don't know.
I think you're right. I don't know either. And I've had similar scenarios, but not just from somebody tipping me off, but often, I've sat down, had a one-to-one with Richard, and then we've gone and got a coffee and perhaps talked about what we did at the weekend over the coffee. And then something will come out from that individual that could have come out in the one-to-one formal setting, but they obviously don't. And therefore, they'd rather do it over the water cooler or the coffee machine because they feel more relaxed now in terms of what they want to say. We are never going to get that in this world. And I guess one of my concerns is as we move forward 2.5 years, 2 years after we have done remote, virtual, do we think that things are going to start surfacing that internal audit may have missed because of the way we've had to function? And what might that do to our professional credibility as we move down the track?
I think you hit it right on the head. I think there's always a risk in, it's an inherent risk for audit that you miss something. I think that risk is the likelihood of that risk coming to fruition is heightened when you can't undertake the kind of in-depth audit methodologies that maybe we have traditionally been able to do in a face-to-face world. So I just think we need to, like anyone who's trying to mitigate risk, we need to make sure we're designing and implementing the right controls to help mitigate that risk. And I can't say right off the top what all of those would be, but I do think that we are classic, sometimes classic cobbler's children with no shoes when it comes to how we operate our own affairs in internal audit. We're always out there quick to point out to others that they have risks that they haven't recognized and they haven't mitigated and that they don't have the right controls designed and implemented. But sometimes I think a physician needs to heal thyself. We need to look at our own processes and methodologies. And this is one of those times. If we're going to try and do the preponderance of our work, if we're going to try and undertake that virtually, we better make sure we have considered all of the risks that could befall us, because that credibility is so important. I sometimes say we have to be credible before we can be incredible, but you really have to be credible in order to be in this profession.
Oh, such wise words, Richard. Thank you for those. So could I ask you then for some final thoughts that you might want to share with our viewers and our listeners regarding skepticism, some key takeaways that they need to think about?
Well, Liz, I think that to me, the most important takeaway is to recognize that skepticism is integral to objectivity. You can't be objective without bringing a degree of skepticism to the role, and that works either way. You can't go in and assume everything is fine, or you can't go in and assume that everything is broken. So you have to. So skepticism and objectivity are integral. We may not have a separate standard on skepticism, but it's interwoven very, very tightly with the concept of objectivity. I think the other takeaway is that we must recognize our own sort of blind spots when it comes to skepticism. We may have over the course of time become too close to those we're auditing in order to, or not too close, but the closer we become to those that we audit, the better, the stronger the relationships, the longer the history, the more we have to really strive to bring that skepticism to the role. And we have to be careful not to get caught in this idea that, well, I can't ask him that because we've known each other for so long and he's going to think I don't trust him, or something approaching that. So we have to recognize that the longer we're in a role and the more relationships we have, the more difficult it'll be to remain skeptical. And then finally, as I said earlier, it's skepticism is what enables us to get to the root cause. I don't know how you get to the root cause without bringing some degree of skepticism to a conversation. So I think all of those things are critical to take away from this conversation.
Thank you, Richard. Some really good thoughts there. So as we come to the end of this Talk to Internal Audit session, some thoughts I'd like to share. As internal auditors, we aim to be a trusted advisor to the governance leaders in all our organizations. This requires mutual trust and respect, and professional skepticism sits alongside this. It's not about mistrust or suspicion, but it's about providing validation and independent corroboration of something that we have been told, a testimonial, as Richard mentioned earlier, or data that we have been given. It's a key skill and the expectation of every internal auditor. Internal auditors should take time to reflect and consider what they have seen and heard throughout their audit engagement, and allow, as I mentioned earlier around the sniff test, allow the audit nose the space to breathe. So if you're just joining us, welcome to our live stream Talk to Internal Audit. Today's session was about gaining a better understanding as to why skepticism is important to internal auditors, and hearing from our guest today, Richard Chambers, about drawing a line between skepticism and suspicion. Richard Chambers is the former CEO and president of IIA Global and was our guest speaker today. So may I say a huge thank you, Richard, for joining me today and for sharing your thoughts with us. Lots for all of us to reflect upon and share with our internal audit colleagues. The live stream.
Thank you, Liz. It's been great to be with you.
Thank you, Richard. The live stream is available afterwards for those of your friends, colleagues who may have missed the live stream on the Institute's Facebook channel. And I would ask you to follow all of the exciting things the Institute is doing on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And absolutely get yourself to be a follower of Richard Chambers, because the blogs that he produces are without question worthy of a read, and they will influence what you do moving forward. The March-April edition of Audit and Risk Magazine is available to members on our website. We are not the same people or the same organizations we were before the pandemic. We've had lots of new experiences, and many have refocused and reassessed our aims and values. We've learned new ways to work and develop different relationships within your organizations. But remember what we've been talking about today around skepticism. So put that into your thinking as we take the lessons that we have learned from everything over the last 2 years. New divisions have emerged with people of various ages and lifestyles responding in different ways and with diverse needs and demands. How deeply these divisions go and whether they will diminish over time is yet to be seen. So our magazine highlighted internal audit's role in the ESG initiative, the opportunities for disruption, and the other side of that, innovation, both within our organizations and within the internal audit function. And we're also starting to think about tackling fraud. You may be aware of the Bayes white paper, Restoring Trust in Audit and Corporate Governance, and that had a whole section on tackling fraud. There is technical guidance on our website for our members around auditing things like counter-fraud strategies. So fraud is becoming something more of a challenge for us and an issue, and often linked to cyber as we move forward. In case you've not already checked it out, the Institute has a brand new community hub where you can get involved, a new gateway to all community-focused activities and endeavours, including our virtual forums, regional networks, and volunteering opportunities. There you'll find a list of all our special interest groups, so if there are any that pique your interest, reach out. Our community hub is open to all members and non-members. So watch this space as it continues to take shape over the coming months. We've also produced some technical guidance around skepticism, and for our members, that's available on our website in the resources section. So please check it out. As we move forward into the new future, please don't forget to look out for Talk to Internal Audit. All of our live streams to date can be found on our YouTube channel. So if you haven't yet watched any, be sure to subscribe. A link to our YouTube channel can be found in the comments section. We will continue to share with you our thoughts regarding specific challenges, along with input from colleagues, members, and guests such as Richard Chambers. So please stay in touch. If you have any specific topics you would like us to cover, please share your thoughts in the comments box. I'm always happy to take questions via email at liz.sandwith@iia.org.uk. Remember, talk to Internal Audit because the Institute is listening. Thank you for joining us. See you next time. Keep safe. Bye.